Hey again to another week of core groups. My hope and prayer is that you already had wonderful discussions, even last time when you guys met and just talking about what has been leading up in the Abrahamic covenant to the covenant. Sometimes we got to leave things behind. Today, though, I tried to cram so much into this one sermon, but in the overarching thought that I had the entire time is like God picking one person, and Abraham had different sons. He had Ishmael, but the promise does not continue through him, and it was coming a little bit by his own doings, right? By the works of the flesh, and then even afterward, he had six more sons, but yet the real promise, what God wanted to do, that red thread that runs through that life of Abraham and through his descendants, he picks the one genealogy and the son of promise, and that is Isaac. And I mentioned about that in Genesis, just a couple chapters later, in chapter 26, we have the promise reaffirmed. And I just want to start off with that one too. And this is where God promises then to Abraham's son Isaac, and it says, sojourn in this land, and I will be with you, and I will bless you. For you and your offspring I will give these lands, and I will establish an oath or covenant that I swore to Abraham your father, and I will multiply your offsprings as the stars of heaven, and will give to you the offspring, to your offspring all these lands, and in your offsprings all the nations on the earth shall be blessed. Again, it's this promise that God had given to Abraham, and it's the same promise that carries on in the next generation. And it just shows us that God is so much bigger than even our lifetime and our span, and all we can do is try to line up our life with His plan and with His purpose, because once we do that, there's history in the making. There is literally, as we see God unfold the story in my life, and how far I've come with God, and all of a sudden there's the next generation picking it up, and things just keep on moving. So the best thing is literally to live our life in that fullness. Later on in Hebrews, I didn't go into this one, in Hebrews chapter 11, again, the author of Hebrews, it's the chapter on faith, right? And it starts out with, faith is the assurance of the things hoped for and the conviction of the things not seen. The conviction. Have you ever been really convinced of something and you just knew that you knew that you knew? But it's the conviction of the things unseen. It's not with our physical eyes that we can see them. We cannot see them. We don't see them. But it's a firm conviction that it's going to happen, and it will happen. And then the author goes into a different character. It talks about Abel and Enoch and Noah, and then he starts with Abraham. And in verse 8, this is in chapter 11, verse 8, by faith Abraham obeyed. Again, he tries to highlight so strong, by faith. In verse 4, it starts, by faith Abel, by faith, verse 5, by faith Enoch, Noah, by faith Noah, and then by faith Abraham. Again, I think we get the message that everything is by faith. It is by the things that we cannot see. We can't figure them out. It's bigger than whatever we can imagine or ask God even, is what God can do. And these are the things that we receive. Our actions matter. What we do today, I brought it down today to November 5th. What we do today by faith matters. It matters in the next generations. And by faith, Abraham obeyed and was called to go out to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance. And so Abraham believed, and he stepped out, and he went. And as we're reading that whole story, there's just so much in that story about everyday circumstances, and then a king starts war, and then 5 kings against 4 kings, and then you have the whole story of Sodom and Gomorrah. You have Lot and normal and family feuds within the family. There's family fights going on, and they have to part ways, and constantly leaving things behind and just moving forward. So Abraham's story is so full of everyday life, and I'm thinking our lives is not so much different. We all have jobs, and sometimes there's messed up family relationships, and people don't talk with one another, and just different things happen in life, and yet at the same time it's like God is still there, and God still wants to do something, and it's about having that faith and that trust in our God, that He's going to get us through, and that God still works out His purposes as long as we are aligning our lives with Him. And then God can do that. And this is what really led up to the whole covenant that God made to Abraham. It basically, God established a covenant, which is a binding promise. And God bound Himself by a promise. Covenant back then was very common. We read in Genesis chapter 11, in verse 22 and onward, how Abraham made a covenant with Abimelech, and he made a covenant with him about just living together. And the one is more powerful because he's a king, and Abraham, he's just a guy, a really rich guy living there, but they make a covenant with one another. So back then in those days, it was very common to make covenants. But man, if God makes a covenant with somebody, that meant a lot back then. It means a lot to us, and we all live in the new covenant. It should mean a lot to us, but sometimes we don't even know what this covenant. It means it's a binding promise, and we're going to get there in the coming Sundays. But we live in the new covenant, which basically means God bound Himself to a promise that we can have eternal life if we just confess our sins and accept Jesus Christ, who died on the cross. I'm pointing to the cross here, who died on the cross for us. And so He bound Himself. And back then with Abraham, He bound Himself to Abraham when Abraham was confused and he didn't know. And maybe God will bring the promise through the servant that is in my house. And He says, no, it's going to be through your own seed that promise will come about. And even then, later on, Abraham's like, okay, then it doesn't work with Sarah, so maybe it's going to come about through the maidservant that's serving the house, Sarai. Maybe it's coming through her. So he's trying to think his way forward about how God can bring about this promise. But in the end, it's not in that one either. It seems so impossible. It seems so impossible for Abraham and for Sarah to have, at that advanced age, children of their own. The biological clock already ticked off. It's not in the books anymore for them. But yet God keeps promising, keeps making that promise. And Abraham wonders, well, maybe misunderstood me. Maybe He's going to do it like this. Like, no, just keep your feet still and just trust God. In just reading this whole story, and then as Abraham is saying, but how can I be sure of that? And then God starts making this binding promise, as Abraham has done before, and he's doing it with Abimelech. He knows exactly how to cut those animals, how to set them apart on one side and on the other side, and how both parties have to walk through those cut animals. And here we have in chapter 15, in Genesis chapter 15, how God Himself, with this fiery torch, He moves and He passes through where Abraham was supposed to walk, and God walks through it, and He shows Abraham through a binding promise, binding himself with a blood covenant, basically, that it will come about. Abraham had no idea, and he had no idea that thousands, millennials later, how Israel is going to come about. He didn't see the promise fulfilled, but we live it today, and we see Israel struggle with those other nations that we know about. Their origins is right here, and some of them have not come under a blessing. They have come under a curse because of one person that messed up or walked away from God. And man, all of this It should give us a real reverence to how God can work with our lives and in our lives. And I kind of broke it down by the end of the sermon about it comes down to what are we doing today, because it can affect our tomorrow. It can affect God's faithfulness to us tomorrow, the fulfillment of his promises tomorrow. It can affect our children and how they live and the circumstances they go through and the children's children. So God's faithfulness has no bounds, and he is outside of time. He kind of sees everything already. He knew back then that Abraham's descendants, their children, they're going to be enslaved in Egypt for 400 years. He already knows that. God already knows what our kids will struggle with. He has seen it, what our kids are going to mess up and they're going to receive blessings, and he has seen it already. But it all ties together with where are we today, and what is the small thing of obedience that we have to do in our today. And I just want to again leave you with that thought. Maybe discuss among yourselves about what are the things that you think right now might impact future generations to come. Or maybe look back and look into the generations before you. And if you had a godly upbringing, maybe just look at that upbringing. Where is that red thread that God has spun all through that generations before you, where you stand today? And maybe there are decisions that you're making right now, job decisions, life decisions, marriage decisions that you're in right now that will affect if you're in a line with that red thread that God weaves through history. And how can you be a part of that? I mean, it's too big for us to imagine. Even we can't even think God is able to do abundantly far, abundantly more than what we can ask or imagine. We can't even think this stuff up, what God can do. So we are so limited in what we know that God can do and what God will do. But from where you stand today, maybe just encourage one another what you have seen as your spiritual inheritance. And maybe you can see a spiritual inheritance that you passed down. And if you can see the red thread running through your generations, and how that also helps you to see your faithfulness and your obedience to God, and how that importance of that in our everyday life and today. And just talk about that and encourage one another. God bless you. We'll see you next week.